text that's found in John chapter 7, verse 53 through John chapter 8, verse 11 is disputed because though it is a famous story, and everyone knows the story of the woman who was thrown at Jesus' feet, and Jesus told her, or told the people, you know, whoever is without sin cast the first stone. Everyone knows this story. It's a famous story, but though it's famous, it is conspicuously absent in the early and the more reliable texts of the Bible, the ones that are closer to the original manuscripts, many of which were not available when the King James Bible was published, so of course it's included there. I wanted to read to you, as we talked about the subject of textual variation, I wanted to actually read to you the notes of Dr. John MacArthur on the subject of textual variation, specifically the variation that's found in John chapter 7, 53 through 8, 11. That's what John MacArthur says, and quote, "This section, dealing with the adulteress, most likely was not a part of the original contents of John. It has been incorporated into various manuscripts at different places in the Gospel, while one manuscript places it after Luke 21:38. External manuscript evidence representing a great variety of textual traditions is decidedly against its inclusion, for the earliest and best manuscripts exclude it. Many manuscripts mark the passage to indicate doubt as to its inclusion. Significant early versions exclude it, and no church father comments on the passage until the 12th century. The vocabulary and style of this section also are different from the rest of the gospel, and the section interrupts the sequence of verse 52 with chapter 8, verse 12. Many, however, do think that it has all the earmarks of historical veracity, perhaps being a piece of oral tradition that circulated in parts of the Western Church, so that a few comments are in order. In spite of all these considerations of the likely unreliability of this section, it is possible to be wrong on this issue, and thus it is good to consider the meaning of this passage and leave it in the text." So this is what MacArthur has basically just said. He said, ultimately, there's a lot of reasons to believe that this was not a part of John's original gospel. This was not a part of what John originally wrote. It doesn't fit with the style of writing. It doesn't fit in the place where it is. And we don't see it in the early manuscripts. And in fact, no one even comments on it as a part of Scripture until many hundreds of years after the Gospel of John was written. So we have a lot of reasons to say that it likely wasn't a part of John's original Gospel. Then why is it still there? Why is it still included in the text? Well, that's an important question, and I think it's one that warrants an answer. It has been included in the text, as he said, because it cannot be definitively proven that it was not a part of the original text, even though there's evidence against it. There are some evidences for its inclusion, so it is placed in the Bible with a note. And the note is for you, the reader. And this isn't something that biblical scholars have tried to hide. It isn't something that any biblical preacher worth his salt tries to hide from his people. The note is in the Bible. And it tells you, it says this was not a part of early manuscripts. And some people read that and they don't understand what it means, which is why I'm doing this video. I want you to understand what this means. It means that when we look at the copies of the New Testament, copies of the Bible, we go back to the ones that were closer to the actual time that the Bible was written, and we say those copies are more reliable because anytime you get closer to the source, you're looking at something that has less of an opportunity for interpolation or adding in anything new or any changes or variations. What we must remember is that while these disputed texts do exist, the vast majority of Scripture is unaffected by textual variation. And no doctrinal position in the Old Testament or the New Testament, no doctrinal position is based on any disputed text. The positions that we hold about justification, about salvation, about the Trinity, none of these are based on any texts that are disputed. These are based on texts that are 100% agreed across the board. This story that we're reading in John chapter 8 teaches a valuable lesson. We ought to read it and understand that its lesson is true and that what it teaches us is true, and leave the scholarly debate as to its inclusion in the Bible on one side of the fence. We can have this conversation and we can discuss its merits, but on the other side of the coin, we ought always remember that we have a responsibility to learn what the story says and apply it to our lives, because it does have an important moral truth. The simple fact is that there are textual variations within biblical manuscripts. They do exist. The originals are what were inspired. The copies are not inspired. We have copies of inspired documents. These copies are not perfect, but they are very close to it. And somebody may say, well, you can say that, but how close are they? How close to perfection are these manuscripts that we have? Well, I have a chart I would like to show you. I'm going to take you through this chart very quickly in the time that I have left, and I want to show you an example of other ancient documents, other ancient writings, and compare them to the New Testament, which is also an ancient document. I put the chart up on the screen here. You'll notice first that you have categories: author, the date that the author wrote, and then the earliest copy, meaning that this is the copy, the earliest copy that we still have, and then the time span from the time the person wrote to the time that we have a copy, and then the number of copies that actually exist. The first one is Pliny. Pliny wrote in 61 to 113 AD. The earliest copy of his writings, 750 AD, that's 750 years after he wrote, is the earliest copy that we have. And you know how many copies we have? 7. 7 copies. Plato, 400 years BC, earliest copy, 900 years AD. That's a 1,200-year difference. 7 copies of what he wrote. Caesar, 100 to 44 BC, earliest copy, 900 AD, 1,000-year time span between when he wrote and our earliest copy. 49 copies is all we have. How about Homer's Iliad? 900 BC, wrote 900 BC. The earliest copy we have is 400 BC. That's 500 years. We only have 643 copies. And in that, you'll notice there's 95% accuracy, which is very good. I think that it's wonderful that ancient documents have been so well preserved and kept. 95% accuracy. And again, Homer's Iliad, when they talk about inaccuracies, they're including as well spelling changes and changes in use of punctuation and things like that. But now look at the New Testament. The New Testament is the most remarkable one on the list. The New Testament was written in the 1st century. Our earliest copies, now it was written, I want to mention this, late in the 1st century, between 50 and depending on how we date John, it would have been either before or after AD 70. But you're looking at very late in the 1st century. And then you go to the 2nd century, it's very early in the 2nd century. So the time span between the originals and our earliest copies, 100 years. Less than 100 years. Possibly less than 50 years between the original and copy. Notice the difference in the above, how that affects. And we have over 5,600 copies. And they are 98.5% accurate. And the 1.5% inaccuracies are mainly found to be inaccuracies of no import at all, that have nothing to do with the text of Scripture. If the Bible, if you look at this chart, if you look at this chart that we've just looked at, and the Bible is singled out to be criticized and rejected as unreliable, then all of these other writings must also be discarded as unreliable, because the Bible is the most reliable text on this chart. And this is only a couple of the ancient documents that can be described. The truth is, no other work of antiquity has the historical reliability that surrounds that of the New Testament. Though there are texts that require discussion as to their inclusion in the original, as we talked about with John chapter 7:53 through 8:11, none of these texts affect one single doctrine of the Bible. That has to be understood if we are to understand the right way to look at textual variations and the Bible. God bless you, and I hope you are continuing to enjoy these Bible studies.